Is anybody else losing in this game? Are you stuck at least?
I'm down $50.
We're the action. That's all it is.
Okay.
Can I give my eulogy? That Berkey was a kind soul.
This was kind of a last minute thing, so I'm a little bit flustered. Don't know the lineup. Had a little bit of a late night. We're gonna have to muscle through, power through, try to do our best here. About to stick a cotton swab way too far up my nose. But yeah, this is gonna be a simple one, straightforward. Gonna let you guys just enjoy the footage.
Hi everyone, welcome to season 6 of Poker Out Loud. We're gonna be playing 5-5 no limit, 100 big blind cap. On day 2, we're gonna play some 5-10 with these killers that you see before you. And again, we're gonna be playing about 100 big blinds effective, so it's gonna be a little bit more conducive to the environments that you're used to playing in. We did throw in the wrinkle of ending each day with bomb pots. I hope you guys all enjoy. Let's get back to work.
Hoping Lando would fold here because this is a dynamic that's going to be pretty interesting to talk about, both from the perspective of the spot itself, but also because of the meta here. I did mention I've been playing a lot of tournaments, and Matt Hunt on my immediate left here has actually been a one-on-one coach for me for a good portion of that time. And more than that, one of the things I struggled the most with when I was working with him was blind on blind. Now this is still a pretty different format because obviously it's cash, there's no ante, but the fact that we already have $5 in there, we could just check, actually makes it a lot more similar, I think, to a tournament spot where if we check here, it's almost like if we limped in a small blind versus big blind situation in a tournament. Based on all that and what Matt Hunt knows about my game, I'm just going to be probably limping or checking a lot of hands in this spot and going for a mix of basically, I guess, technically check raises, check calls, and check folds here. If we somehow get it folding around to us here a lot, I may have to rethink that dynamic based on what we see develop, but I don't think that's likely to happen here. So my actual hand here could function a few different ways. Obviously, I could just stuff it into a raising range, but I think that it functions fine as a check call or as a check raise. But I feel a little bit more comfortable check calling and just playing post. So that's what I'm going to plan to do here to any reasonable size.
Okay, so these blind on blind spots are going to be pretty weird when we're playing 5-5 because obviously Matt doesn't even have to put any money in the pot to see a flop. I'm expecting, in terms of strategy, I think that he's probably supposed to play a strategy where he has obviously an extremely wide limping range and then probably a pretty polarized raising range. Once he limps, I'm going to be raising a lot of hands, but relatively linear range, and this hand is just too trashy, so this hand is going to be a check.
So disregarding my exact hand, this is a board where if I'm implementing my pre-flop strategy correctly, I actually think that I will have a pretty reasonable range advantage. I'm going to be checking pre with a lot of very strong holdings that connect with this board. And I expect that because Hunt here is last to act pre-flop, he doesn't really get to check that many pretty strong hands behind. We're just too deep for that to be a profitable decision with those hands. So he's going to be raising hands like king, queen, ace, king, kings plus, probably hands as weak as king 10, as well as potentially even some of the more polarized, weaker king X hands. So in terms of, what I can hold here, I'm going to basically check pre with a bunch of the very strong holdings on this board that he can't have. What that probably allows me to do is that even though I'm out of position here, I think I get to bet this board at a pretty reasonable frequency. and at a small size. But because we're playing this 5-5 dynamic and we've both limped, I can't actually bet a percentage of the pot that I would typically go for here, and I'm forced to bet half pot or bigger if I do bet. With my exact holding, I think this does function well as a bet because he can still have a lot of top pairs, a lot of flush draws, and a decent amount of floats even just with backdoors or a deuce. And it's very unlikely he has a 7, but if he does have one, he'll obviously be continuing. So I think that I'm just going to go with a min bet here. And obviously, there's not going to be many situations where I'm folding on later streets.
$5.
Okay, this board is generally going to be pretty good for Matt's range in comparison to mine because his limping range is going to have a few more strong kings in it than mine will, but it's generally going to be a pretty decent spot because I can still have all the 2 pairs and maybe the occasional set here of deuces. My actual hand, I think, is going to serve fairly well as either a call or a raise. Bottom pair tends to raise pretty comfortably in a lot of these spots because it benefits a lot from equity denial. I think that if I had a heart in my hand, I would probably raise just because get a few more folds and have a little bit more equity. But I think when I don't have a heart, it probably plays a bit better as a call. So we're just going to call.
So because of some of the wide range dynamics at play here, I think that versus my min bet on the flop, even though it represents half pot, Matt Hunt will correctly deduce that I can probably have a pretty wide range to bet the flop with. And like I said, he'll have a lot of backdoor draws he's willing to continue with, in particular the ones that are sometimes good at showdown, hands like ace high, queen high, even some jack high, that connect with this card a fair bit. I think that this hand can function a couple of different ways on this exact card. We can bet to try to keep getting called by a king, by a hand that picks up a 9, and probably by a deuce for at least one more street, most likely. Or we can check and let him bet with any hands that have very little equity, still bet his king X, and potentially even start value betting a 9 if he turns it here. So I think that in order to protect my checking range here, I think this hand is going to fit pretty well as a check. It also lets me get more money in the pot the times that he actually does have something, which is a little bit of a problem for this holding when we're just playing this effectively checked pot pre-flop. As you can see, there's only $20 in the pot, so this hand kind of desperately wants to put more money in, and I think the best way to do that right now is to check and attempt to check raise, probably fairly large.
Okay, so Matt decides to check this turn, which I expect a relatively high frequency. There's going to be a decent chunk of hands of his that can continue barreling, but not that many. A 7's going to check. A turn 9 is probably going to check a decent frequency. I don't expect him to check hearts or straight draws very often here, but he can have some hands that are checking with the intent to check raise. This hand plays very naturally as a check back because I don't really have much reason to bet here. If he had bet, I probably would have continued just because in this kind of formation where ranges are really, really wide, it's really difficult to fold bottom pair even to a second barrel here in a small pot. But since he checked, this is a really good opportunity to just realize my equity, check back, and hopefully win a showdown.
Well, that's a little bit too bad that he checks back because obviously we can't shovel money into the pot like we would like to. The good news is this card allows me to still probably retain an advantage, put pressure on a capped range, and put more money in the pot a little bit of an unconventional way here with a bet flop, check turn, overbet riverline. I'm still allowed to check turn with some pretty strong hands like I did. I don't think he checks turn with that many strong hands. Again, having position, he's a little less incentivized to find checks with strong hands on the turn because he's a lot fewer ways for me to put money in when he does that. Now the pot is pretty tiny, so I think something like a 2x pot overbet is going to be pretty reasonable to get called by maybe small pairs if he doesn't raise in pre. Occasionally just look me up with ace high that has backdoors rather than front door draws. This is a spot that's admittedly pretty new to me. This is not the situation I'll find myself in a lot, so I'm not super sure how he will respond, but it is a spot that I think will be pretty effective through an overbet, and we just might not get believed that often. So I think I am going to bet 40 here.
40 is the bet.
So this is an interesting bet from Matt. He bets 2 times the pot. This is a spot where I would expect that, well, first of all, it's important to establish that my hand is clearly just a bluff catcher. The other sort of question that's in play here is how far up in my range am I? How much do I care about potentially being exploited? Things like that. And I think the answer is I'm sort of midway up in my range. I don't think I'm that high because I would occasionally check back a king on the turn, and I would also have a 7, a decent chunk of 9x. Plus, I think a lot of my queen highs and ace highs are going to play this way and get to this point, so I can comfortably fold all of those. The question is whether or not I need to call with the deuce as a bluff catcher, and I think ultimately the answer is probably no. I imagine this spot is somewhat underbluffed, given that I would think a lot of Matt's best bluffing candidates would continue on the turn, like a lot of his 8 highs, like 8-6, 8-5, 6-5, a lot of his hearts, a lot of his jack-10, queen-jack, jack-8, all that type of stuff is probably going to continue the turn with some frequency. And so I think a lot of what he ends up arriving at the river with is potentially some fairly strong 9x, a little bit of king x, obviously a decent chunk of bluff candidates, but when I have a hand like deuce 4, I block a few of those. Some of those, random like 5-4s and stuff like that. So I think this hand is probably going to be a fold. So we're just going to ditch it.
All right, so in for 1,500, out for 540, losing 960, and there's nothing like a friendly game where you have to individually pay out all 4 of the people who won in the game. Yeah, it feels really shitty. That's how it feels.
By the way, guys, I'm opening a new club on Club GG. We'll be running games from 10 cent, 20 cent, all the way up to 1-2 to start, and I'd love to see you guys over there. Just join Discord so that you know all the details about getting started.